So let's go ahead and get started for today's, or I should say this month's Bench2Market talks. Or good afternoon to everybody who's on the East Coast and good morning to everybody who is not. My name is Adam McCallum and I am delighted to be your host today for this month's Bench2Market talk. For those people who are not, or this is maybe their first time to a Bench2Market talk or who are new to this program, I wanted to thank you all for attending and remind you all that this is a fruitful collaboration between Biolocity, Georgia Tech's Pettit Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, as well as the Georgia CTSA. And before we get started, I wanted to give you all a couple of housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded for those people who either cannot attend or who would like to go back for reference material thereafter and watch the presentation. We will be uploading this video to our website as well as our YouTube page. So please go check that out. As well as if you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to drop those in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat during the presentation or during the webinar, and will allow the guest speakers today to address those questions at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to make this this webinar as collaborative as possible. So again, please feel free to ask as many questions as you can. For those who are new to Biolocity or who haven't really heard of us before, we do offer a variety of pro bono resources. One of those resources is our legal office hours. If you have any questions about sort of patentability, intellectual property, etc., we do partner with an Emory Law School professor. Her name is Nicole Morris, and you are more than welcome to set up an appointment with us to talk about a variety of topics or areas of interest related to intellectual property and patentability. You can see a list of resources here that we can address and use the link down below to make an appointment with us. In addition to our legal office hours, we do offer pro bono technology consultations. So this will give you an opportunity to meet with the Biolocity team as well as our entrepreneurs and residents to talk about anything and everything related to technologies or innovations that you're developing here at Georgia Tech or Emory. Please note that you do not necessarily have to be ready for funding for us in order to schedule these technology consultations. If you have an idea, as simple as something that you've written down on paper and you would like to discuss with us what your options are, feel free to reach out to us. We provide a variety of resources that will be advantageous for you if you have an idea or anything related thereof. In addition, Biolocity is a member of the BARDA Drive Network. This is a network that is devoted to funding to create solutions for global health security. And that provides a variety of different funding options for technologies that fit into a variety of different buckets. Many of those are shown here on screen. So if you're interested in sort of exploring funding opportunities that fit into some of these buckets, please feel free to reach out to the Biolocity team and we'll be happy to sort of discuss those options with you. The last thing that I wanted to mention before we sort of get started with this presentation is that our next Bench2Market talk will be next month on March 19th from 12 to 1. This webinar, it's actually a hybrid event, is discussing sort of investment and dilution, which is a very hot topic for people in the startup space and entrepreneurship space. This event will be hybrid, so it will be a combination of both a webinar as well as an in-person event. It will take place in IBB in the Sudeth Room on the first floor on Georgia Tech's campus. So if you're interested in this, please feel free to come attend the event either in person or online. That being said, I want to now introduce our next guest speakers for today. So Brian Walsh and Keyton Weissinger, they will be presenting to us on how to build a compelling pitch and communicating your go-to-market strategy. So with that being said, I will pass over the mic to Brian and Keyton. So please feel free to introduce yourself and then we can get started.
Brian, you want to start?
Sure. My name is Brian Walsh. I have been doing Class 2 and Class 3 medical devices for about 40 years. That's an older picture, I think. And yeah, I've been working with Biolocity and I don't know, for the last 8 or maybe 10 years now. So hopefully we can provide some information and give you some guidance here that'll make you.
Hi, my name is Keyton Weissinger. I am the COO of Copient Health and the CTO of Copient.ai, which is a spinoff company that's been created since this picture. I am more on the SaaS startup front. I've been in the startup entrepreneur from 2003 on, so about 20 years. I've done several exits in that time, and I'm focused on a lot more technology-driven startups than on the medical or medical device side. And as Brian says, I look forward to sharing some information with you about how to pitch and how to pitch your company, how to pitch yourself, and get started in this exciting world of entrepreneurism and startups. All right. Okay. So I'm going to start and I'm going to talk very specifically around pitching your company. And I'm going to do that within a couple of different contexts. The first and main is when you go to a pitch event. So a lot of times you are going to be pitching with 10 or 15 of your closest startup friends, and you're pitching to a fairly large audience. There are several events like this, and what you want to do is a very specific get in, get out. It's a 10-minute pitch. And we're focused on that 10-minute pitch, not an elevator pitch, right? So it's 30 seconds or whatever, but that sort of in between where you've got people's attention that you want to get something from, you want to tell them about your business, your idea, your startup, etc., with a very specific ask of that specific group. Special shout out to Jay-Z at this is Atlanta Tech Village. She put this presentation together. It is fantastic. So I use it with my own slides of our company, Copient Health, as an example. And I encourage all of you to look into the various items that they offer at Atlanta Tech Village, and we'll actually be talking about one of those a little later. All right, next slide. All right, so you're going to see that main sentence, you want to tell a story, on a lot of slides, because this is the most important thing you can get across, that I can get across to you, is you are going to be in a group, again, 10, 15 other startups, all trying to get attention from the audience. And the only way that you're going to stand out is if you tell a compelling story and address these specific things in the order that we're talking about. Right now, again, this is a very specific kind of pitch, and there's other things that you may need for other types of pitches, but you'll be doing a lot of these if you're doing a startup like this. So to start, the most important thing you can do is if you've got a group of people in your startup, you want to find the one who can speak the best, most clearly, and make it as easy as possible for people to hear you, etc. Don't worry about, long names, anything like that. Just use your first name and keep everything as simple as possible. You don't want to drag on, but you also don't want to talk too fast, etc. It's that sweet spot. But the clearest speaker of your group should be the one on stage doing this, even if that person is not the founder, CTO, CEO, etc. Okay, because communication clarity is the critical part in one of these. So you want to tell a story. Next slide, please. All right. So I've introduced myself. Hi, I'm Keyton. I'm going to tell you a story. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my company, right? So I'm going to talk about the name. If I've got a logo shirt, wear it. Can't hurt, sorry. And what I'm trying to do is get you to remember that name, okay? Each of these items are items that each of these sections that we'll talk about today has a very specific takeaway that you want to make sure that that audience hears, right? This one is, as you might expect, the name of your company, because they're going to look it up later. They're going to look it up online. They're going to email. They're going to ask folks about it. Make sure that that's the case. And now is the time to start thinking, probably before this, now is the time to think, is this name hard to say? Is it easy to mispronounce? Then maybe a different name is going to be helpful, right? Okay, but be very careful of that. Next slide. Here's an example. So this is from a deck that we did a couple of years ago for our company, Copient Health. And so if you'll see, I've got the name of the company, the logo, very straightforward. I've got my name. I have just introduced myself as Keyton. You can see that it's Keyton Weissinger on here, not that big a deal, but it's very, very clear what we're doing, okay? And in terms of the name of the company here. And that's what I want you to take away as Copient Health. Next slide, please. Okay. So you have an idea of the company name. Great. Why am I here? And this is that the first thing that the investors are going to start paying attention to. You hope they remember the name, but this is where you're going to start actually getting into your story. Okay. The next step is the why of the startup, the problem that you're trying to solve, et cetera. And I cannot stress this enough. This is not what you do, what you offer, your features, your product, anything. This is the problem in the real world that your company is trying to solve as clearly and as concretely, measurably as you can make it. Next slide, please. So as an example, our company basically helps medical facilities get more revenue. And here's the problem, right? 68% of revenue and 60% of operating margin are coming from the operating rooms in these facilities. However, the problem, these operating rooms are idle and surgeons can't get access to them. So if you think about it, that is as clear a problem as we can have. Your biggest money maker is sitting idle because you can't get to it for whatever reason. Okay, next slide. So I've told you about the problem. Now I can get into the solution. I've made it very clear what the problem is. I've done my homework, so I know how to tell that problem in such a way that the audience is going to identify with it, right? So if I'm with a group of, crypto folks and I do, healthcare, they probably don't care about what I do. So I may not even go to that event, but I know that these other people really are interested in healthcare, understand this problem. And so I've made the problem as clear as I possibly can. Now we're going to start getting into the solution, and this is what we do. Now it's very easy as a startup that's probably been working potentially for months on your solution to get way in the weeds. Don't do it. Whatever you do, don't do it because they don't have that time, right? You need to get very clear about how you're solving the problem you just laid out. Okay. Now, down here at the bottom, this is JC's comment, what I love. Where are you on that spectrum of pain? From oxygen to Chanel number 5, right? So it is, you got to have it or it's nice to have, but it might be really nice to have. Next slide, and we'll go over some examples. All right, so what do? We basically provide solutions that use machine learning to improve that contribution margin that we were talking about. The whole gist, and this is, if you notice, this isn't necessarily on the slide, but this is what I'm talking about. The end result is more money, right? It's improved contribution margin, et cetera. How do we do it? Machine learning. But what we're doing is we're getting at that expensive resource, your operating rooms, in such a way that you can free up some of the revenue from that operating room. Remember the problem, this is the solution, okay? And then I kind of dig into, all right, well, what does that get us? Next slide. So very clear statement. And if you'll notice, none of these slides have a lot of bullet points. None of these slides have a lot of information on them. I'm talking about them and I'm trying to get one point across. If I get you 1 single hour of operating room time, it's a 4x ROI on what we provide on our service, right? So, okay, I've just told you the solution and I've just told you, what the benefit is. And here are the success metrics, which is the next piece of this of, okay, we've been doing this for a while and this is what we actually do. We solve this problem and here are the metrics to measure how well we've solved that problem, because you're just saying I solved the problem isn't good enough. You need to be able to show how you've actually measured the solution of that problem, and that's what this is about. Okay, so we talk about very specifically, okay, our clients, we got these increases and look at that ROI. Very clear. Next slide. All right. So the next piece of this is talking about customers and competitors. This can change, and this is going to be very specific to your audience. In this particular deck example that I'm going to be showing you, for us, it was very clear that the audience who pays for this. So I don't go over that very well in this deck, but it's very clear who the competitors are. Along these lines, what we want to do is begin to differentiate ourselves a little bit, and I'll show you that in just a minute, about, okay, you're the customer or whoever the customer is and who the competitors are, but how are we different? Okay. The biggest issue here is this is not about who uses your product and maybe not even who benefits from your product, but who pays you money for the product. You want to be very, very clear that you are selling to person X and person X wants to buy from you for these reasons, right? Next slide, please. So this is an example of a competitor slide, right? This is a little bit busy, and I've seen this now a couple of times. Every time I think, I should probably tweak it. But this is giving you a very straightforward view on screen of where, where we are in terms of simple, focus, etc., compared to the competitors. We're talking about a lot of different things here, and a lot of they're important to get across how we're different. Now, this is going to be very specific to the sort of sub market and the genre and the niche that you're going after. In our case, there were some existing companies that had a fairly large footprint. And what we want to do is we want to make absolutely sure that the audience is clear about how we're different from those competitors. Because again, a little bit of a crowded space. So in this case, we talk about our simplicity versus complexity. We talk about our focus being sort of more the ASCs, et cetera. And we talk about, different costs and things like that. We also talk about being sort of small and agile. These are very large companies that are very focused on a very big set of problems, but there are a lot of healthcare facilities for us that are smaller, more nimble. They need someone more nimble like us to help them get there. So we're giving a lot of information on this slide to help differentiate us from competitors that our audience at this time was aware of. Again, this will be very specific to your niche and your product. Next slide. We talked a little bit about how we've now differentiated us from the competitors. Let's make sure that they understand that we are different from the competitors' teams. Our team is different from theirs. And this is where you want to talk a little bit about your team and specifically any direct experience that those investors are going to want to be interested in. In this case, the team that built Copient Health had two very successful exits, and we sold a company, Dialogue Medical, in 2011 to Taylor Healthcare, and then Clockwise MD in 2017 to Xperity. And so having a successful exit and a team with that experience is very important. You may be competing in your group with folks with no experience, no startup experience, and certainly no exit experience. Again, very valuable and very valuable to those investors. Next. Okay, almost done. The next piece, the last final piece, is what are you actually asking for? You have an audience. And what you want to do is be crystal clear with this question. And you need to think about it when you're making your slide deck for this of exactly what you're asking for and as explicit as you can, right? So if you can just see the next slide, very straightforward. We want $5 million, period. That's what we need. We are doing that for growth, and in this case, fall of 23. And we want, we had already, so even in this handful of words, you're getting that we already potentially had an angel round. We already had a Series A, and we're only asking for a little bit for Series B, but we showed you how we're solving the problem. how we're different from our competitors, and how our team is positioned for success against those other teams, we're asking for a very specific amount of money. And here's that our whole goal, obviously, is not for somebody to write me a check, which would be lovely, but is just to get the next meeting, right? That's your goal in these 10-minute presentations, is to tell this story with the goal of getting the next meeting. So at this point, they know exactly what you want. They know exactly who you are. They know exactly how you're different from the competitors. They understand your solution and they understand the problem. Okay, those 5 things. Next slide. Closing out, I want to encourage everyone who is in sort of a startup space, beginning to think about pitching. Go to this website. The folks at ATV have a pitch practice every Friday. It is fantastic and it is extremely helpful to prepare you, especially if you don't have a lot of experience doing this, to actually get in there and pitch with people that actually understand what that's about. I know that Brian's going to talk a little bit more about specific elements that are current in terms of what people want for a slightly bigger investment deck, right? And he'll talk about that next. But as you're doing these 10-minute pitches, and you will do a lot of them in a startup, get practice. Have a friendly audience. This group is fantastic, and they're going to push you to be better. And that concludes my section of this talk, and I'll hand the mic over to Brian.
Could we pause for a second, Adam, and see if there's questions for
Absolutely.
Keyton?
No questions so far in the chat, but if anybody has any questions really quick for Keyton, actually, while we're waiting for that, just in case people are currently writing, I do have a question for Keyton. So a lot of our audience, at least in this particular seminar, are academics, or is composed of academics, right? And I mentioned you talked about sort of, what it's like to go up against people who, like yourself, who has, been a part of several companies that have made successful exits and things like that. But for academic researchers who are maybe new to entrepreneurship and who are, the team is composed of researchers, professors, whomever, who don't necessarily have experience in entrepreneurship or building a startup company, but still want to be successful with pitching their idea to investors, whether that's for dilutive funding, non-dilutive funding, et cetera. How do you really make yourself competitive amongst a sea of other people who may have experience with being successful with particular exit strategies or whatever?
So 2 things. Obviously, the softball answer is, especially if you're at Georgia Tech or Emory, go talk to the folks at Biologity. They're going to help you do exactly that, right? But maybe more importantly is have a very good measure of where you are different from the other folks trying to do that, and play to your strengths and shore up your weaknesses. For example, we talked to, as part of Biologity, we've talked to several very academic groups, and you've got a professor and a postdoc maybe, and something like that, maybe a student, and they've got a great idea, but they've never sold to a hospital. They've never sold a thing to a person. I strongly recommend that you find partnership with folks that understand the financing, that understand the business, but most importantly, that understand the sale of a thing. One of the things that we ran into, one of the challenges that we've ran into with several groups through Biologity is they had the perfect thing. They have the perfect solution to a problem that either one, their target audience didn't actually have, or didn't have enough so that they would pay for it. And I think take a cold hard look at what you're doing and make sure that you have someone. The best way to do that, to get successful even before you pitch, is have someone pay you a little bit of money to give for your solution. If it's $1, it counts, right? If it's free, it doesn't count as much, especially if it's inside your ecosystem, right? So if you're a healthcare technology startup and you're working with Emory because your professor is down the hall from another professor and blah, 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 that's important. That's really good, valuable information. But remember, it is a very, very friendly audience. They're not giving you any money. get to that next piece. Other questions? I'm going to be here through Brian's thing, so if something comes up, I'll be here at the end as well.
There are two questions. I think we might be able to address these really quick before Brian gets started. So one of the questions is, would you say these insights apply to pitching to ex-US or more global audiences, such as maybe like Latin America or Asia? If not, how would you tweak your approach?
Great question. First and foremost, go back to that first thing that I said, and who is the best communicator is obviously it's going to be the best communicator talking to that group of people, critical, right? But other than that, the story that you tell is going to be very specific to the audience, and you need to be aware of the audience's understanding of the niche of customers to which you're buying. So, don't go to Argentina thinking you're going to be able to pitch your American healthcare problem solution if they aren't really familiar with American, healthcare problems, right? And that, so long as the audience is the right audience for your niche, this works just fine. Absolutely. Other question?
Yes. Thoughts and suggestions on having two people pitch, especially for a medical device product. Is having maybe like a clinical founder advisor voice the problem more compelling or suggesting?
Great question and great idea. If you do that, I would keep it to two, not more. Two is sort of the upper limit, in my opinion, for a 10-minute speech, but also practice, 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 practice. You want to make sure that that is just smooth and boring as you can make it for you, but then liven it up for the audience, because you don't want to, well, who's speaking? Are you going to take, but you don't want that, or you don't have time for that. So as long as you practice it, that's good. And to your point, to the point of the questioner, if that person is an expert in that and the audience cares about that, that's really important. And the audience cares about that expert nature of that thing, then it definitely sells that better.
We had one quick question come in right as you were speaking, and we'll save this question. This will be the last one, and we'll let Brian speak after this. But how soon do VCs, angel investors, whomever you're pitching to, how soon do they get back to you typically?
If you have dice, or from like 20-sided dice even, and you roll that, and that's going to be the answer. It's going to be different for different things. A lot of them are going to get back to you if they're interested pretty quickly. They're probably going to talk to you right after and set up something. Do not expect this to be fast. Do not expect to get that check tomorrow. Do not expect to get that check within 6 months. Because it's going to take some time, because they're, generally speaking, they don't get to make the decision by themselves. They're going to sell it up the ladder. They're going to have lots of meetings. They're going to do their due diligence. They're going to crawl into every aspect of your business and understand it before they give you money. It is a slow process. And that's why I'm saying you're going to give these pitches a lot. So slow process. And Brian can probably comment also too on sort of speed, but I would say if you hear from somebody within 3 or 4 weeks, fantastic, you're doing great.
And kind of to Keaton's point, this is part of a process. So what we're talking about here are non-confidential decks that are given in public forums, if you will. Usually VCs won't sign an NDA. And the steps that occur after this, maybe we want to go deeper, in which case, okay, we're going to get into a more specific presentation or a meeting. But usually it involves something called a data room, which has a whole bunch of other information. It's like a Google Drive type thing that has, the regulatory, and you have a whole bunch of different topics in that, but it's beyond the scope of this particular talk. So, this is kind of the entry point, and the whole point here is get them interested so that you can get the definition of winning here is having a second conversation. So you got to make sure, it's compelling, and to King's point, kind of short and tight, because they're not going to give you much time. And keep in mind, they see, dozens, hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of pitches in a year, who knows, right? But a lot. So you need to stand out, right? And if you make it hard for them to go through, or hard for them to repeat the value proposition to their partners, you're going to have a challenge of getting traction. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that. All right. You ready?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
There was some comment about my audio not being great. So. yell if it's not good. So it just happens to end up about 2 months ago, I was in a different setting and I had a VC present what they believe the perfect deck is, which is interesting. It's the other side of the coin because all of us are thinking about what did we present, how did we win, how do you go about this? But this is the audience side from an investor's perspective. This is granted one specific VC, but they had done some work and actually looked at what were the contents, the common elements in all of the presentations that they funded over the last whatever it was, year, 2 years, or whatever it was. And this is what they came up with, which aligns very much with what Keyton just showed. They said 10 slides, maximum 15, but don't be tempted to go to 15. Fewer the better kind of thing. The the order is a little bit different than Keaton talked about, but in general, it's about the same. A couple points I'll make on number 5, competitive advantage. Competitive advantage ties to why is your technology a great innovation? It isn't just like you have a bunch of competitors, but it actually shows that you're aware of the marketplace and how you fit relative to the landscape in general. And let's see, the repeats in here. I think that was the main ones in terms of this, but the point was 10 slides, short and tight. Let's go ahead. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit where Adam was going is, largely everything we see in Biolocity is academic kind of rooted, if you will. So I wanted to kind of compare a little bit just for context, how to think about things. This is general kind of research aim that you see for academic approach, which is, maximize understanding of the phenomena, emphasize creation of new knowledge. How does it work? Why does it work? What are all the mechanisms? You build consensus in your team. And then afterwards you document, write, publish a paper, etc. That's kind of the way, which is a bit different. So if you go to the next slide, in industry, you think about things differently. A lot of go, no-go decision making. You want to minimize time to market, be capital efficient, which means you make the money go a long way, and mitigate risk. So you don't need to build consensus. You don't need to find every possible solution and pick the best. It's pick a reasonable solution and move forward. You may do something else. And in a perfect world, the way the FDA describes how you do things, you should document before you execute. You write specifications before you develop a product. You don't develop a product and then write specifications afterwards. And the typical process is something like the part on the right, though it varies based on therapeutics versus devices, which is some sort of research, then you do bench work and maybe some animal work, maybe not, and then ultimately you end up in the clinic. But it's a very different context. So you have to kind of recalibrate your brain a little bit and how you present that, because the people you're presenting to live in this world, okay? So you want to demonstrate that you also can communicate in that manner. Go ahead, please. So this is actually a chart I've borrowed from Shauna Corey, which talks about value inflection points. And this is a really important concept. And the walk-away message for this slide is you don't get partial credit, okay? And this ties into how you do your work, how you develop plans, and how you ask for funding. So at the beginning, if you start on the left-hand side, at the beginning of your project, you have maximum risk, right? You're at the very, very, very beginning, and then you're going to start to do things. And over time, risk is going to go down because you're going to do de-risking steps. You're going to figure out how it works and then a bunch of other stuff, right? But also, if you look at the far left, if you look at cost, you have no money at the beginning, right? And you have to get more money. And the more things you do, the more costly it becomes. The important principle here, though, is the value bit. What you'll see is on the green line that there are step functions here. And those are the value inflection points. So if you get between two value inflection points and you work on something, but you never get to the value inflection point, the investment community kind of doesn't care. They think of things in terms of value inflection points. Did you get to design freeze? Did you get to a prototype? Did you get to a first in man study? Did you do an animal study? And do you actually do it? Not, I worked on it, but we didn't get there. In their world, that is not a success. So you have to, so as you communicate and as you think about what you're going to do, think about it in terms of value inflection points. And I'll show you a little bit later in this presentation what typical ones are and how to incorporate them. One thing I will talk, yeah, great, thank you. So yeah, that's great. These, for the most part, Keith was talking about an unregulated product. He was talking about products that work in the OR that were software based, that optimized workflow and process for ORs. For most of you, you're going to be dealing with regulated products. They're either going to be devices or software or drugs or biologics. And because they're regulated and regulated by the FDA, the approach is prescribed by the FDA. So the steps and gates you go through are important. And since the FDA has defined them and investors know them, it's important that you include them. If you don't include them, it'll drive questions or questions about, like, do you actually know what you're doing? Or if you create new types of major milestones, if they lack the others, it will look odd. So the investors know they're, people that invest in medical products aren't the same people that invest in Kool-Aid, right? These are different types of investors. So for these, they know how to do this. And so here's some of the typical questions you need to think about as you approach this. And then I'll show you how to develop some of the milestones. But what classification is it going to be for your device? There are 1, 2, or 3 based on risk. Are there similar products out there? Are there applicable FDA guidances? There's actually written documents on the FDA website. There's ISO standards. You should know about all of these things. What's typical bench testing that is done with these types of technologies? If phantoms are used, what are those like? And what are the acceptable animal models? The whole point on the accepted animal models is you don't want to invent or choose an animal model that the FDA hasn't already seen before. You want as few questions to get through the FDA as possible, right? So you're de-risking it. So you need to say, if you're doing, something in the pulmonary space, or you're doing cardiology, it's going to be swine, right? It's not going to be minks or something like that, right? So you need to find things that are well accepted and well known. On the drug side, are there processes used by other similar products? And what are the accepted small and large animals? You're going to go through formulation, scale, safety, efficacy, and dose. All of these things always fit into your plan for a drug or biologic. And so you just need to think about where do those fit. Now, as you go through this, most of these teams are quite early, so you won't go all the way through these. But you knowing about what the pathway is important to show that you're knowledgeable and you have a sense, so your investment is safe. Should go ahead, please.
Before, for those people who may not know, can you briefly explain what phantoms are?
Oh, phantoms. So for example, if you were doing an imaging device, there's something called ACR NEMA phantoms, for example. And so in those cases, there are standards or FDA guidances that say, show me the resolution, show me sensitivity, show me specificity in those. And you're supposed to show them on those accepted phantoms that are standard tools, if you will. And so that would be part of your deliverables for the FDA, as an example. So here's just a very simple kind of roadmap. And I'll show you again how this maps into your investment strategy and your milestones. But for a class 2 medical device, so it's a moderate device, it's got a predicate. These are the types of things that you would expect to see as milestones, where you do some sort of proof of concept and development, and ultimately you freeze the design. And that means you don't change it anymore. The verification bit here means you do a bunch of testing on it. And if it doesn't work, you go back and fix it. So if it was software, you'd go back and fix the software and then freeze the design again. And ultimately, you're going to go through a bunch of verification testing, and then you go through validation, which might be animal or people. In this case, it's class 2, so it's a 510(k) clearance by the FDA. And then you go to first customers. These are very typical big milestones you'd expect to see in any work plan or investment plan for a team. Should you go ahead, please? And for therapeutics, it looks something like this. instead of design freeze, you have a lead candidate. You do IND, phase 1, 2, 3, which phase 1 is safety, phase 2 is efficacy, phase 3 is a pivotal clinical trial. Something that's important to realize, though, it's much more expensive typically to go through a therapeutics beginning development process beginning to end. And so at some point in here, you actually have to, your technology needs to be acquired by somebody who does this professionally, somebody in industry, because this phase 3 trials can be hundreds of millions of dollars. And the likelihood of you getting there through VC style investment is questionable. So you actually don't go through all the phases. You need to know about them, but you also you have the clock's ticking, right? It's a little bit different. The clock's ticking in the other case as well, but it's possible to get through the entire process under your company as well. So let's go ahead, please. So this is that same value inflection, and if you look across the bottom, it kind of breaks it into those various sections. So where it says clinical development and then approval, in large pharmaceuticals and companies, that's typically that phase 3 bit. So somewhere, if we're in the university bit, we'll take it forward and create a biotech company and get partway through this, but there'll be an exit somewhere as you get through this development process before you get to the end. And if you can't exit, that becomes a challenge. So go ahead, please. So here's typical value inflection points, and I'm going to explain those because I'll show you how they fit on a map. Patents are value inflection points, completion of animal work with results, a proof of concept, design freeze, testing complete, first in man. But you'll notice they're all completions, right? They're events. They're not like I worked on it or we're in the middle of doing more. We've had an event. Okay. Go ahead, please. So this is what a development, and there's many ways to present this. You can put the dollars on the bottom or on the top and use different colors, but across the very top here, it has the value inflection points. Okay. So in this case, it shows design lock. You'll notice phase 1 at 120K was tied to the design lock. In this case, the phase 2 is tied to cash flow positive. Phase 3 and product extension gets all the way out to the larger sales volumes. And across the bottom are kind of the development aspects, right? So testing, the 510K filing, which is the FDA review, market launch, manufacturing scale up, CE mark, which is like getting FDA but in Europe, and then European launch in this case. So the whole point is, in a snapshot, you can kind of tell timing, the value inflection points, the development that leads to the value inflection points, and the funding. And so usually these slides don't say, I wrote development plan on top for the purpose of this presentation, but the way this might more typically be structured is across the top. It says seeking $120,000 to reach design lock. So there's a yin for yang thing. You ask for dollars to achieve a milestone, okay? Or seeking $1.3 million to become cash flow positive or something to that nature. So as you think about the ask, you're going to figure out, okay, what do I need? What do I get to? And what you don't want to do is ask for this to work on something, right? You want to ask for it in order to deliver a result, because that will ensure you also get follow-on funding. If you come up short, it's hard to come back and say, yeah, we miscalculated and now we need a bit more money. That's a really difficult conversation. And it doesn't bode well for the general process. So I don't know if I have any more slides.
No, that is the last slide.
Okay. Well, that made sense. Questions?
I can unshare my screen now. So if anybody has any questions for Brian or Keyton, please feel free to include them in the chat, and then I will moderate those questions to the panelists.
Does that mean we confused everybody or?
Actually, while we're waiting, I think I may have a question, especially, so as you mentioned, the majority of our audience is going to be developing things that are going to be likely regulated by the FDA, right? And when you're talking about including this information in a pitch, how much information is too much information regarding sort of FDA regulatory strategy, milestones that you've met or want to meet regarding the FDA regulatory strategy, et cetera?
So, well, let's just talk about FDA in general. So, it is, yeah, it's the regulating body, right? And so investors kind of look for, they want you, if you can, to have, what is your regulatory approach going to be, right? So if you know your classification or the type of product, if you know what gates you have to go through, that's all great. Um, and so I generally describe it a couple ways. One is that you can, as an individual, like, Adam goes over and says, okay, I believe this is a class 2 medical device. And so on his pitch, he says it's class 2 medical. And in conversations and questions, and they'll, they'll for sure drill down on that because it matters a lot. And so there's a couple ways you can answer a question, right? One is we believe this is a class 2 regulated device. Its predicate is the such and such catheter or whatever, right? And that's an answer. The next best answer is you have, and you need money to do some of this stuff, okay? But the next best answer is you get a formal opinion from a regulatory professional. And they'll write you a letter and they'll say, yeah, based on a survey of whatever the stuff is, the guidance is, standards, this is a class 2 device. The reasonable predicates are these, and here's the meetings you're going to have. And you'll be able to articulate, we've had a regulatory professional review the situation and formalize an opinion, and it's in our data room. And then the next best conversation, and this doesn't happen all at the same time because this is kind of over time, is we're in conversations with the FDA. We've met with the FDA or any of those things. But I'll warn you, you don't want to do the last one unless you have a regulatory professional involved. This is not, it's very, very treacherous to, if you're inexperienced. I would never approach the FDA directly, even though I've been doing this for decades, without having a regulatory person involved, because certain words kind of key off and have other meanings and history behind them. And so you don't know that, especially if you're kind of a newbie to the space. And I'm not a newbie, but I still would never do it. But if you're able to say to an investor, we've had communications with the FDA, we're in conversations with the FDA, which would be something called a pre-sub, which is a pre-review meeting. And then at that point, they would, you would have probably confirmed the pathway, the predicates. If you're doing biologics, you might do the animal models, the size of the study, stuff like that. So they want to hear that, those things are confirmed. Otherwise, they're a risk until you sort them out. But if you can put them to bed, that takes some of the risks off the table. That was a long answer. I apologize.
Okay. I wanted to ask a follow-up question. You've mentioned data rooms several times, and to a lot of academics, that may be a foreign concept or a foreign term. So at what stage in sort of the entrepreneurship process or the startup process should you be thinking about creating a data room for, protein and things?
Yeah, so a data room, and there are examples online, but you're going to have, so a data, it's like a Google Drive or one of those, and you have a bunch of chapters in it. You're going to have something on marketing, you're going to have something on reimbursement, you're going to have something on regulatory, you're going to have something on engineering, you're going to have something on past investment. There's a whole bunch of those. You can find all that stuff online. And usually you create that after you've formed a company and when you're out trying to pitch for venture money, for equity money. Usually that's the time you do that, and you populate your data room. Because the way this conversation goes is we might have this initial non-confidential pitch, we might have a follow-up meeting, but if they're interested, they're going to ask about a data room relatively soon, because that enables them to go kind of under the covers to figure out where are you really, and like how did your experiment come out, because it's going to have some results in it, stuff like that. And so usually it's in when you're asking for money, you're going to need to have that, and it's typically you could do it, I guess, when you're doing seed type money as well. But in my experience, it's usually around the time you go for venture. I don't know. You might have a different view.
I think there's going to be very different in sort of technology and things like that, and in terms of when that happens. But generally speaking, they'll ask you, they'll say, "Hey, we need to set up a data room," and that's when to do it.
We did have a couple questions coming through the chat. So the first one can be for either of you. Can you speak to the status of the current VC investor climate for biotech and or healthcare companies? So what does that look like these days? It's a very broad, open-ended question, but hopefully.
Sure.
Yeah, I I hesitate to answer only because every day something comes across. I get an email that says, "This is up, this is down, this is up." I'm not sure I can say. And given we've had some pretty serious changes with the new administration, which may impact FDA, it may impact many different aspects. I'm not sure what to say at this particular time. I don't know if you feel comfortable, but I'm not sure I can answer that.
Well, I think that now is a pretty chaotic time, right? So you've got, never mind, even without the current administration change, you've got a great deal of change in technology, artificial intelligence, and what LLMs mean to pretty much every sort of investment out there to some extent. You've got a little bit of chaos, and in those times, there's generally opportunity, and the smarter and sort of more interested investors are going to take advantage of it. So I think that it's definitely out there. I think maybe finding it is a little harder, but I think you're going to find some folks that are like, okay, now's the time to invest because it's a little crazy out there. So
Another question for you all is when you're pitching a regulated solution, how do you balance protecting your IP via giving them enough info to demonstrate novelty?
that's all you, Brian.
So yeah, presumably your IP would cover your product. So you're doing non-confidential decks. Um, so you're going to the level, at least at this point, for these pitches where you're not going to disclose anything that you don't want somebody else to know. And also keep in mind, especially for some technologies, especially software, a lot of times IP isn't filed and it stays in the company and it just becomes kind of company confidential stuff. So you more black box it, you talk about results, you talk about what you did, what the results are, exact performance, but you may not get into mechanisms and process. It's also, that's also one of the things as you develop what you develop, the OTT at level of what level of disclosure, if you plan on commercializing something, especially in like software and things like that, becomes really important. Um, when I worked in the Silicon Valley, and we had 200 software developers, we filed very little IP. It all stayed inside the company. Um, yeah, it's a little bit of a different approach.
I would actually kibitz there and say that for software specifically, I've been doing this for 30 years, I guess, and I have been a part of exactly one patent ever. And pretty much anytime we talked about an NDA or IP, of getting patenting some kind of software process or even an algorithm to some extent, most lawyers are going to say, "Don't waste your money for the
I,
software."
I will comment again, these decks would be non-confidential. VCs don't like to sign NDAs. You might get them to sign an NDA when you do a data room
Right.
and you get to that step because you're actually disclosing, more detailed information. Um, but um, yeah, you have to be a little bit careful about that. But I know it's interesting to a lot of the people that develop the science, like how, what, and all that. but if you can characterize results and kind of framework around it, that at least should drive interest.
Awesome. Those looks like those are all the questions that we have at the moment. We have only a couple of minutes left. So if there aren't any other questions for the panelists, then what we'll do is just would like to thank you all so much for coming and speaking to us. Super insightful information, really valuable. And yeah, thank you all very much. And we hope to hear from you soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.